Go for it. Okay. Well, I don't really have a presentation as such, so I'm going to just wing it a little bit here. I feel like I just did kind of a comic and cosplay convention in July, and we talked about horror fiction or dark fiction, and I talked about what inspired me to start writing it, and I kind of shared that earlier, where I just discovered these stories that were unlike anything that I'd experienced, the likes of Ray Bradbury, Robert Bloch, and Richard Matheson, Theodore Sturgeon. Some of these guys had these incredible twist endings, like O. Henry. They took me to places that I'd never even thought of visiting before in my mind, and 25 years later, that's what I wanted. I said to myself, if I could make somebody out there remember my story, one of my stories 20 years from now, then that'd be good. That's what I want. And so I'm still an avid reader. I don't have a ton of time. I work at the public library, and it's water everywhere, not a drop to drink, because I'm so busy that I rarely read anything. But I'll get there again and start reading. And so I wanted to sort of emulate and try to find my own voice within that. And I've learned that a lot of my favorite authors, they have very distinctive voices, and you almost feel like you can guess at their personalities by reading what they wrote. One of the things, if people, they're like, well, I'm not into that. It's so dark and it's so depressing, and I don't get anything from it. And I totally respect that opinion. I feel like with any genre, whether it's horror or romance or mystery, westerns, you get to live in a different world for a while. And I guess that's true of all fiction, honestly. But you get to live in a different world, and for me, it's when you're reading a scary story, you can enjoy it and know you're not in any danger. Just like in a Western, nobody's shooting at you. If you're reading a mystery, you're not going to wind up dead, that type of thing. And so you can meet these characters through the last sentence of the story, word for word, but you had to find out how to get there. And for me, that's a fun journey. It can be frustrating sometimes, but you hear a lot of people say things like, oh, he's got a real Jekyll and Hyde personality, or, well, the devil made me do it, things like that. Everybody has both good and bad parts to their nature, and the good should always win out, and the good should always be prevalent. But I think every once in a while it's fun to pretend and look at the other side of the coin sometimes. Are we supposed to be done at 9 or no? Okay. Well, I don't have a presentation, but I do have an 8-page story that I could try to breeze through real quick. Is that too long? They're snoring. Wake up! I'd rather just read a story anyway than talk about the creative progress. Yes. Is it all set there? Okay, cool. I'm gonna actually just shut this off here. Before I close this is the book I have available here tonight, Bottled Spirits. The anchor story, the longest story in here, and also the cover story is set in 1880s Deadwood and mixes fact and fiction, of course. And then this new one just came out a couple of weeks ago. I don't even have copies of it yet. Tension of a Coming Storm has half dozen stories that I wrote with people that followed my Adrian Luden's author Facebook page. And what I did was I would write a scene, and in my mind I would have 3 possible outcomes to the scene, and I'd have the people vote on it. and then I'd write the next scene based on what the votes were. It's kind of like a choose your own adventure that was really popular when I was growing up, and I learned a lot because the readers would often pick what I didn't, what I would have personally picked isn't what the readers wanted, and so it's always nice when you can get on the same page, so to speak. This is a story called Pedestrian Encounter. I will try to resist the urge of reading it too fast that I stumble, but I'll try to get through this. Justine placed a clean coffee mug on the drying rack. Her fingers, beginning to prune, searched the soapy dishwater and grasped a greasy skillet. She scrubbed in silence, her mind working out how to best defend against the world's loudest noise. It was scheduled for that evening. When Justine looked out the window above the sink, she noticed the man. He stood on the sidewalk outside her gate, turned away from her, staring at the sky above the tree line. In the living room, Justine's mother, Ruth, announced in a croaking sing-song, "A house is made of walls and beams. A home is made with love and dreams." "Sure, Mom," Justine murmured. She never knew when the old woman would dispense one of her time-worn maxims. Simple wisdom gleaned from her childhood, perhaps the last things she remembered clearly. Justine dried her hands on a dish towel, her eyes never leaving the motionless figure. "I need to run outside, Mom," Justine said. "There's a man on the sidewalk that looks like he needs directions." Then, though her mother wouldn't understand, she added, mostly to herself, "Or maybe he's just worried about tonight." Ruth did not reply. Justine left the house through the kitchen's battered screen door and followed the cement walk along the side of their home. She paused at the northeast corner of the house and observed the man. He remained on the sidewalk, as if rooted to the spot. Justine scrutinized the stranger. His salt and pepper hair was cut short, and he wore slacks and a faded red polo. She couldn't see his face, and for a giddy moment pictured him without one, a flat, featureless cipher. An urgent need to put this irrational fear to rest pressed her into motion. She strode across her small but well-maintained lawn. "Can I help you, sir?" The man turned at the sound of her speech, swiveled his head to watch her approach. Justine noticed his eyes first, pastel blue and sorrowful. His receding hairline, drooping jowls, and crow's feet framing his eyes betrayed his age, which Justine estimated as being about a decade younger than that of her mother. "I don't see how you could," the man said. "Well, I just happened to notice you standing here." Justine trailed off. A lone tear had spilled down the man's weathered left cheek. "You look familiar. Do I know you?" The man roused himself. "Maybe. I live a few blocks down the street." He straightened and wiped away the tear with the back of a liver-spotted hand. "I'm sorry." "You don't have to be sorry." Justine felt bad for staring. "It's all right to cry. It's healthy." The man shook his head. "I'm sorry. I'm here. Sorry to convenience you." Another tear fell, and this time he did not bother to brush it aside. "I think this whole damn country's going crazy." "Well, what's wrong?" Justine asked, though she thought she already knew. The man gave her a look. "Well, this thing's scheduled tonight over at Getz Air Force Base. It's madness." Justine glanced up and down the sidewalk. "I think so, too." The man met her gaze with rheumy eyes. Justine felt her throat tighten, and she spoke in a hurried, hushed tone. "My mother's an invalid. She can't travel. You and your family could still book a flight. Get as far away as you can before it happens." "My wife and I already had that argument." He winced as if reliving the scene. It became rather heated. "She loves the idea of the world's loudest sound. She says you can't wait for it." "I'm sorry to hear that you and your wife are at odds," Justine said. "I need to get back in the house. My mother's mind wanders, and I should go check on her." "Oh." The man's shoulders sagged. "Okay." Justine had already made it halfway up the walk. She re-entered the house, looked in on her mother. Ruth rocked in silence, her features serene. Justine returned to the sink. The soap bubbles had popped during her absence, leaving the remaining dirty dishes submerged in gray water. Reluctantly, she looked back out the window. The man was leaning against her fence like a drunken guard outside Buckingham Palace. Justine shut her eyes and wished the stranger away. It didn't work. Why would I stick my neck out for someone I don't even know, she muttered. I need to be preparing for tonight. She'd finish the dishes, then begin experimenting with her canning wax. She wanted to try to fashion some heavy-duty earplugs before tonight's event. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Like countless times before, her mother had set her straight by quoting scripture. Or was this the golden rule? Justine sighed. You're right, Mom, you're right. With the noise weighing heavy on her mind, Justine returned to the yard. The man turned toward her when he heard her approaching. Would you like to come in for coffee? Could I get a glass of water? I'm so mad my mouth is dried up. The man paused, then said, I'm Darren. Water for Darren, coffee for me then. That sounds great, he said. A wistful look spread across his face in the shadows of the cloud overhead. Will your mother mind? Not at all. She's kind of in her own little world. Justine made 2 cups of instant coffee and rooted around in the kitchen cupboards until she found a half-empty box of crackers and a sleeve of Girl Scout cookies. She drew a glass of water from the tap for her visitor and dropped in a trio of ice cubes to cool his drink. She also added an ice cube to her mother's coffee so she wouldn't burn her tongue. Darren received his glass of water with thanks and ate one of the cookies, though Justine thought he only did the latter to be polite. Ruth gummed her crackers and chuckled, caught up in the excitement of entertaining a guest. I wish they wouldn't do it, Darren said at last. He seemed to have calmed, resignation replacing his exasperation. But if they insist, why not do it over the ocean somewhere? Why here? Who knows? Maybe just because they can, Justine said. Maybe to distract us from something else. Maybe to help sell earplugs. I don't know. Well, good Lord, Darren complained. It's a colossal show, but for what purpose? Justine set her mug aside and brushed a few crumbs from her mother's mouth. It's sound and fury, signifying nothing. Darren smiled. You said it, sister. Well, Shakespeare did, anyway, Justine remarked. I don't think Shakespeare's your sister, Ruth said, frowning as she studied their guest. Justine, despite herself, laughed. She took her mother's hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. This is Darren, Mom. He lives down the street. Of course he does, Ruth said, then turning to their guest, added, It's always nice to have you visit. Darren gave Ruth a lopsided smile. The world's loudest noise. Who came up with that anyway? Justine asked, steering their conversation back to the topic at hand. As if the idea itself isn't appalling enough, it sounds like a 4th grader came up with the name. Darren nodded, and not a particularly bright 4th grader either. There's no underestimating the intelligence of the American people, Ruth interjected. Both Justine and Darren stared at her. She brushed the last of her crumbs into a napkin with a gnarled hand and then leaned back and sat primly in her chair. This is doing her good, Justine said, looking at Darren. Maybe you should visit more often. Maybe I will, Darren said. His features showed a measure of resolve. We just need to get through tonight first. Justine nodded. I have a plan. I was going to try to see if I could fashion heavy-duty earplugs out of melted canning wax. Good luck, Darren said. I hope it works. He rose. I thank you both for your company. He bowed before Ruth, who only smiled uncertainly in response. Justine saw him to the door, and then, on impulse, walked with him to her gate. Darren turned to face her. Thank you. An unexpected lump filled her throat. Justine tried to reply, but couldn't. Darren's face wavered, distorted by her brimming tears. She leaned in and hugged him fiercely, then stepped back inside her gate. Darren shuffled away down the sidewalk. Justine returned to her living room and cleared the dishes from the coffee table. The water in the sink had gone ice cold by now. She drew a shuddery breath and gazed out at the empty street. Darren was right. It seemed like everyone had gone crazy. She felt like Alice, exposed to a grimmer, more dangerous wonderland. Justine felt grateful for her mother's continued presence. Ruth had always been there for her only daughter, imparting wisdom, giving advice the best way she knew how, in the form of recycled axioms and proverbs. Even as she had succumbed to the disease that eroded a tiny piece of her mind with each passing day, the old woman always seemed to know exactly what her daughter needed to hear. Justine returned to the living room, knelt at the base of the rocking chair, and took one of Ruth's hands in each of her own. "This too shall pass," Ruth announced from her chair. Like she'd so often done as a girl, Justine sat at the foot of her mother's rocker, watching television as the minutes ticked away. She massaged her temples and tried to make sense of it all. The president's announcement, the rabidly enthusiastic response of his supporters, military's compliance. She'd listened to the talking heads bickering on television, where scathing sarcasm and vague threats offset effusive praise and anticipation. Justine ran through scenarios in her mind, imagining what she'd say if she unexpectedly had the entire country as her attentive audience. The light in the room, she realized, had dimmed. Justine cast a sudden look at the clock above the mantel, and she saw she had less than 2 minutes until the appointed time. She shot to her feet and ran to the kitchen in full panic mode. There wasn't enough time now to melt the wax. Justine clenched her hands into fists. Her nails bit into her flesh. Would foam earplugs be enough? She doubted it. Justine tried to remember her intentions regarding the protection of her eardrums, but all rational thought had fled. She yanked open the junk drawer. It flew all the way out, scattering its contents across the floor in a colorful, clattering avalanche. Justine let the empty drawer drop from her numb fingers. "Mother, Mom, what should I do?" Before the old woman could respond, a sound rose in the growing dusk. Justine ground her teeth in frustration. She covered her ears with her hands, knowing it would do no good. She'd failed in her vigilance. The only thing she could do now was hope. She curled into a fetal position on the kitchen linoleum as the noise rose in volume. Each time Justine thought the roar couldn't get any louder, it did. It became unbearable until one eardrum and then the other popped in quick succession. Even then, Justine felt in her body the sound's concussive, unrelenting force. "Please," Justine prayed, "just let me hear her voice again." She rose and steadied herself against the counter. Her cheeks were awash with tears. She sniffled, wiped her nose with the back of her hand. It came away smeared with blood. She rapped her knuckles on the counter, but heard nothing, not even the ringing that comes with complete silence. She knew if she looked in the mirror, she'd see twin trickles of blood coming out of each ear. Shattered glass from the kitchen window had tumbled into the still-filled sink. An ambulance careened past. Justine saw its light rack flashing, but heard no siren. Her entire body shook with apprehension. Justine picked her way across the refuse-strewn living room floor until she reached her mother's rocking chair. Here, too, the tone had shattered the windows. Ruth slumped to one side of her rocker. She held one hand over her heart as if she meant to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, but her features were slack, her eyes glassy and vacant. "Mom?" Perhaps she said the words. Perhaps she only thought them. "Can you hear me? Are you there?" She watched her mother's face for signs of movement. She held trembling fingers to her mother's neck, feeling for a heartbeat, but found none. And then she heard it. Her mother's voice, coming from somewhere behind the old woman, but not from her lips. No mother and daughter ever live apart, no matter what the distance between them. Justine, cradling Ruth's motionless, already cooling hands, sank to her knees and began to weep sweet tears of relief. That's sort of a low-key. Nobody got stabbed or dismembered in that one.
Thank you for that performance. It was very good.
Yeah, a lot of a lot of people, if you say horror, they think like 80s slasher films or something. And my version of horror is much more growing up with Alfred Hitchcock Presents and The Twilight Zone. So.
That's very reflective in your work. So thank you, Adrian. Thanks, Adrian Luden, for being here.